Hello and welcome to episode number 32 of the Real Life Podcast. I hope you're all well. In this episode, I'm going to be returning to something which this podcast strangely seems to be lacking, which is straightforward reviews of films. I've collated my thoughts on some of the most recent releases, which I had the time to catch, and I thought I'd run you through my thoughts on them. This episode is the second last of the year, with a big Christmas special coming before the big 2-5 and the big Baby J blows out his candles once more. Today I'm going to be taking you through reviews of 7 different films, and they are Gladiator II, Alien Romulus, Star of Acre, Woman of the Hour, Joker, Folie, Deux, Speak No Evil, and finally Conclave. There's a big array of stuff in there and much to discuss, so without further ado, let's dive into the reviews. Okay, and let's start off with a big one. We're going to do Gladiator II first. So, this is directed, obviously, by Ridley Scott. If you need any reminder of who he is, that's Alien, Gladiator, Blade Runner, Black Hawk Down, etc., etc. And it is written by David Scarpa, who did The Day the Earth Stood Still, and also Napoleon, Ridley Scott's last work, which was, less said about the better. The film follows on from the 2000 epic with Paul Mescal playing Lucius Verus Aurelius, the grandson of Marcus Aurelius, 16 years after his death. After a Roman army led by General Acacius, played by Pedro Pascal, invades and conquers Lucius' home city of Numidia, Lucius has his wife murdered and is forced to fight in the Colosseum in Rome for twin emperors Geta and Caracalla, played by Joe Quinn and Fred Hedginger, respectively. After the first session, he impresses Macronus, who is Denzel Washington, who is utterly fabulous, and becomes his fighter after being promised the opportunity to kill Acacius if he wins all his fights as revenge. In my view, this film is blockbuster filmmaking done right. Consider me entertained. Yes, it is covered in issues. The main motivation for Lucius is a little rehashed and obvious, as is the rest of the plot, and despite how well the scenes are done, given that sort of underpins the whole plot of the film, it feels sort of beneath the first one. But there is a huge amount in this film that obviously was in the first anyway, and there are elements to question like, why does Matt Lucas have an inbuilt microphone in his throat? Paul, who the hell needs to wear a helmet? Mescal is, just used so we can always see his face and how wonderful he is, and children were presumably not playing football like that in the Roman Empire, but I think you have to allow it to take liberties elsewhere. But that doesn't stop it being properly enthralling. It is cast perfectly. Everyone is seriously bringing their A game. There are quite literally 5 faultless performances at the heart of the film. Mescal, Pascal, Tim McInnery, and especially Denzel Washington and Joe Quinn are 5-star bits of work. I just bathed in their excellent character work for the whole film. I just believed in them all 100%, and it has to be said, I think the visuals as well are a real success. Compare this to Napoleon, which looks absolutely disgusting, and this looks like Starry Night in comparison. It's brutal in the right ways when it wanted to be, with exceptional production design, and occasionally the colour palettes were a little bit off, but that was kind of it visually in terms of any kind of complaint. Obviously it does feel a touch more trivial than the first, but that's only because there's so much of the first film in it. Details like Denzel constantly adjusting his robes the way he wants to adjust the power in Rome, loving the fabric of the robes he's wearing, and loving every second of his time whilst he's doing it is why there should be, and definitely will be, Oscar buzz around this man's genius. It has some cold lines of dialogue which are belter all the way through. The sound is really strong because of its clarity, its timing, its mixing. It's really nicely balanced. And the thing I really love the most is that this film gives everyone's character the chance to really be a character. All the acting being stellar is a result of the characters being absolutely 5-star knockouts themselves. You know me. I love when character is done right, and this is done to the nth degree and without caution. It is fabulous. That's why I love Joe Quinn so much in this, is his character is completely no holds barred, and there is no reason for him not to explore every single element of that personality in the way that he does. The design of the thing is wicked, the monkey dogs are scary. I know the sharks in the Colosseum is a little bit weird and over the top stupid, but it's entertaining as all hell. It felt to me like an ode to the first film, respecting it rather than ripping it off, with a smart script, luxury character work, and great visuals. I might be being slightly too kind to it, but I was just having a really good time. Here's the way I see it. The first film was us right down on a level with Maximus, with him in every fight, every battle, feeling all of his feelings, his pain, his loss, his grief. But this time out, the focus is very much on the spectacle, on the entertainment of the whole thing. This time we aren't on the level of the gladiators. We are in the stands of the Colosseum watching on, being entertained. So much of the focus is on, things like Matt Lucas and his announcement and feeding that into the narrative and how the people in the crowd respond to the wild things that they are seeing. I think that's the way to view this film, and for me, it has absolutely worked a treat. Ridley has stopped his rot. If this is what you're going to do, play on, Ridley. Just be careful, because don't do the last two again, because House of Gucci and Napoleon were both absolutely terrible. This is more like it. Are you not entertained? Yes, we bloody are. Okay, moving on to Alien Romulus. I saw this at my local cinema back home, which is a gorgeous little theatre, and it felt very much at odds with this deeply unsettling sci-fi romp. So, it's directed by Fede Alvarez, who did things like Don't Breathe, the Evil Dead remake, and last year's Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, which doesn't actually bode brilliantly for this, but it was written by him and Rodo Sayagues, who co-wrote on all the previously mentioned works. Here's the premise. Alien Romulus takes the franchise back to its roots with a fresh take on its narrative. It's set between the events of the first two films in a mining colony controlled by the notorious Weyland-Yutani Corporation. The story follows Rain Carradine, who is an orphan scientist eager to escape the company's grip, and her adoptive android brother Andy, and a small group of desperate colonists. They embark on a daring mission to try and salvage hypersleep chambers from a derelict space station. What begins as a heist quickly spirals into horror as they inadvertently awaken dormant xenomorphs trapped in a decaying station swarming with deadly creatures. The group must navigate betrayal and sacrifice and the corporation's sinister experiments in their fight for survival. I wish the opening of this film was how the film was the entire time, because the opening is magical. The silence of space technique always works for me. When a camera starts in space and doesn't give you any sound until it moves into an environment where there's air, for the sound waves to travel, that always sounds great. And the colours we see at the start as well just make it even more impactful. These deep reds and this fabulously obscure imagery of this egg being lowered into the spaceship. It was utterly glorious. But I do wonder if there's a slightly frustrating clash here between sci-fi and horror, because for loads of it, it's quite enthralling to observe. Its structure is a bit generic, it must be said, and a one-by-one pick-off job we all saw coming from a mile off, but that doesn't stop the look of the thing being knockout, because it really does look good. But the script is largely expositional, which is a shame, because the visuals don't seem to fit that. The Gallo Olivares cinematography is sort of the star of this film for me. The silent sequences are really strong, and the dialogue-heavy ones are very much less so. The film focuses in a lot, again, on the idea of Andy and the android versus human debate. Some trust him, others very much don't. It does feel, again, like its main job is throwing a million pointers back to the originals, and given the point on the Alien timeline that it takes place, that kind of makes sense, I suppose. But the inclusion of what is essentially an AI Ian Holm, a digitally remastered version using his image, that does feel slightly too much. It fits into the story in a sense, in a really weird way, with that android versus human debate, and I can actually see why they did it, but something about it really does feel off, and like it maybe shouldn't have been there. And Sam Adams from Slate actually made the comparison that the film studio and the villainous Weyland-Yutani Corporation in the story are very similar, and they liken them to mining IP instead of letting the dead rest. It is something worth noting with this, because I don't think the film actually needed it. Despite how weirdly it fits into everything, it still just feels a little bit out of place. But the film absolutely deserves a ton of praise for its prosthetic and prop work, because once more the xenomorphs and the facehugger parasites in particular are genuinely terrifying, and the film does an exceptional job of bringing back the genuine terror of aliens, particularly that the first two films had. It's just a shame that so much focus was given to the exceptional nature of the horror elements, which is brilliantly done, and far less attention was diverted to the story beats and other elements, because it could have been an absolutely terrific film otherwise. The end is also absolutely tapped, like it is mental. I left the small cinema in my hometown to head to my car, completely befuddled at what it was that I just witnessed. It didn't quite feel like I was having a genuine evening. The score from the ever-brilliant Benjamin Wallfisch was a really chilling piece of work, actually, which does a lot of the groundwork in setting the tone. It is a slightly frustrating one in the end because some of it was utterly superb, really scary and really enthralling, and some of it was almost incomparably different in scenes where you could see exactly where the dialogue was going before they'd even said it, and in those cases it really is a shame because you almost think, why bother saying it? But if they can follow this up with what I presume is going to be Alien Remus, with something that it has the same terror but a better story at its heart and a better way of expressing that through its actual storytelling, I really don't subscribe to the critics who say this franchise is dead, because this was actually nearly pretty good. I know that's not the most ringing endorsement, in fairness, but I honestly, if you like the first two, I'd give it a watch just out of intrigue, because the horror elements of that are absolutely back where they should be. On to Starve Acre this time. This one won't need as much time because it's a fairly straightforward review. It is directed and written by Daniel Kokotaljo, who did a film before this called Apostasy, which I confess I have not seen, but it's based on the book by Andre Michael Hurley. So Starve Acre follows the story of Richard and Juliet, who are a couple grappling with the profound grief in the secluded countryside home after their young son Owen dies under mysterious circumstances. From there, the couple begin to unravel emotionally, and Richard immerses himself in local folklore, obsessively investigating the sinister history of an ancient oak tree on their land. Meanwhile, Juliet turns to a spiritualist group in search of closure, as Richard's research leads to unsettling discoveries, including a horrifying supernatural presence tied to the tree. The film blends folk horror and psychological drama in order to tell its story. It's set in an oppressive autumnal atmosphere, and it looks into themes of loss, guilt, and the eerie intersection of the natural and the occult. And these are all accentuated by performances from Matt Smith and Morfydd Clark in the lead roles. Now, both of those lead actors do a really good job with what they're given in this film. It's a sort of one of those films, I'm afraid. Matt Smith's Yorkshire accent is very good, but I'm afraid the whole film is incredibly plodding, dull, and quite obvious in a lot of ways. There are countless shots of the Yorkshire countryside which, whilst all very wistful and pretty, eventually become totally meaningless because there is so many of them. It takes a while to do the thing, and then when it does the thing, it's kind of like, oh yeah, well, obviously it was going to do the thing. I wanted to love it a lot more, but the endless shots of slightly different parts of the Yorkshire countryside ended up not meaning much in the end. But Smith and Clark are strong performances. The music is a touch anything goes because we've gone weird, but it's an eerie tale. It could have been told, and would perhaps have been better told, quicker. I wish it had been made weirder or faster, one of the two, because I don't think it quite worked out how to pick its lane, and that meant it ended up being a far more turgid affair than it probably wanted to be. It also contains one of the most ridiculous dogs you've ever seen, which is quite funny, but I felt there was much more to get out of this story. It's an interesting enough tale, but I felt that the ending really should have floored me a million times more than it did. We needed a load more work investing us into the actual history of the setting, not just a scattering of information which ends up being piled on heavy in the second act in a way that you don't actually get the chance to properly absorb. The themes of family and loss and yearning for order and going mad and emotional expression, I think they could have been explored a lot more creatively or thoroughly given the right approach, and I could very much have done without the satanic lady from Yorkshire being quite so hysterical to observe. I mean, I know it's sort of the point. You're supposed to be sort of slightly pitying them in a sense, because you just think, you are nuts. But when she starts wailing, I can't do anything but crease. It sort of falls into the what could have been category, but unfortunately, it'll probably be remembered as that film where Matt Smith turned northern with a ridiculous haircut and there was a satanic rabbit. It's a bit of a shame, really. On a more positive note, Woman of the Hour. It's directed by Anna Kendrick of Anna Kendrick fame, and it was written by Ian MacDonald, who did some Freaks and also worked on the Superman Returns film in the early noughties. Set in the 1970s, Woman of the Hour follows Cheryl Bradshaw, played by Anna Kendrick, who is a struggling actress who reluctantly agrees to appear on the popular game show The Dating Game to boost her career. But unbeknownst to her, one of the contestants she interacts with is Rodney Alcala, played by Daniel Zavato, who is a charming but deeply sinister figure hiding a history of violence and murder. As Cheryl navigates the show's superficial glitz and the sexism of the entertainment industry, Alcala's dark tendencies simmer just beneath the surface, and tension mounts as Cheryl unwittingly chooses him as her date, leading to an unsettling encounter that forces her to confront his true nature. It is based on a true story, and the film balances the drama of the game show with an exploration of Alcala's crimes, shedding light on how systemic misogyny often enabled predators like him to operate unchecked. It's a really timely piece, which is a shame, because it's set 50 years ago, and it still feels really relevant. It's based on true events, obviously, but Anna Kendrick tells a story really interestingly and considerately. By placing the horrible attacks by Alcala in between segments from the game show and Cheryl's life, it gives us a really sort of human approach to the actual events. I thought it was pretty confidently directed for a first-time feature work, and I'm really interested to see where Anna Kendrick goes from here. It's important, it's uncomfortable, and it is saddening. Anna Kendrick shows just enough to make the mood of the scenes measured and disturbing, and she performs her own character with her usual ease, and there's some excellent moments of tension, and the dinner and the parking lot scenes, if you have seen the film, are both expertly done. They're the highlights of it. Some of the dialogue ties into the over-egged 70s style of the TV show. That works really well in this context. In some of the other contexts, it doesn't quite land as such, but with so many punchable, terrifying men, you just can't stop crawling. In some senses, the brutality of what you see is quite fleeting, and what that does is make the possibility of what could happen all the scarier. Hence why the dinner and the parking lot scenes work so well, because we are all aware of an inherent danger, which makes us anxious. It's not just plain scared about exactly what is going to happen and feeling like at any second we're going to see her head get beaten in or something horrible like that. It's also worth saying that Anna Kendrick's performance is actually really good, which is not easy when you're writing and directing. Kenneth Branagh. Sorry. The script does a really good job at creating a convincing and yet really discomforting world, and it's the kind of film which most men need to watch, because you really quickly get a sense earlier on that Cheryl has to work super hard to avoid things she doesn't want to do, and the men in her life expect and require very certain things and will throw their toys out of the pram if she doesn't provide them. What's nice is that the film really avoids a fascination with Alcala. It doesn't go in any direction that might sensationalise his actions, and instead keeps his role very much as a perpetrator, not a figure of interest that we want to spend ages examining. I'm getting really fucking bored of true crime shows, stuff like Dharma, because I don't really want to dive deep into this psychopath's mind. I just think it's a waste of time, and I also think the producers really are just doing whatever they can to exploit the sadness of those events and the shock value of them to give themselves some sort of compelling drama that people might want to watch purely because it is outrageous and tagged as such. So I have a lot of respect for the fact that this film is really able to steer away from that. I really enjoyed it. I think it's absolutely worth everyone's time. It sort of flew by because I was really enthralled by it, so I really recommend Woman of the Hour. We're back on the blockbusters, and this time it is Joker Folie à Deux. It is nowhere near as bad as everyone says it is. So it's directed by Todd Phillips, who obviously did the first Joker, the Hangover films, and War Dogs, which is a film I'm a huge fan of. And it was written by him and Scott Silver, who also did 8 Mile and The Fighter. Folie à Deux delves back into the chaotic mind of Arthur Fleck, who is now institutionalized in Arkham Asylum and awaiting trial for his violent transformation into the Joker. While grappling with his fractured psyche, Arthur encounters Harleen Quinzel, Lady Gaga, a mysterious fellow inmate with her own troubled past, and the two form an intense and dangerous bond that blurs the lines between reality and fantasy. The film, presented as a musical thriller, uses elaborate musical sequences to explore Arthur's psyche and his unsettling connection with Harleen. As their twisted relationship grows, Harleen becomes a manipulative force, encouraging Arthur to embrace his chaotic identity. Meanwhile, the shadow of Arthur's impending trial looms, with ambitious district attorney Harvey Dent leading the charge to hold him accountable for the havoc he has wrought. I really like that it isn't a film that dives into Arthur being a fully fledged, effective villain, because everything we were told about his character didn't match that. It's a film that reminds you Arthur isn't the evil you thought he was, and reminds you that in this incarnation, Gotham is a place to fear which won't look after you, and Arthur is a consequence of it. I don't mind the singing at all. I totally get the choice to do it. I think it's actually quite a fun choice. I think it emphasises that blend between reality and fantasy in the minds of the two main characters. I just don't think the songs are flat out bangers, and the jukebox choices are really sort of down the line and boring, but maybe that's the point. Arthur isn't a particularly nuanced individual anymore. He's been reduced and subdued to someone who's become susceptible to Gotham's dampening influence. But I appreciate Todd Phillips having a go at the fans who got the wrong end of the stick from the first one and tried to sort of idolise the guy. It moves strangely, it must be said. Its pacing is really, really unusual, and you don't quite know when you're moving fast or slow. I like the colour scheme a lot. Its palette is interesting. Its shots feel a touch contrived, to be honest, but the song's inclusion all mean something when they're there, and that's important. I give credit for the film trying to do what it did, and it wasn't doing it for the sake of it. It was doing it because it was effective in the story it was trying to tell. It isn't half as bad as you're saying it is, so have a dial on your outrage. It's intriguing, and it is a touch slow in places and a bit plodding, but it's a film of consequences, and that's an excellent choice for me. You know, Arthur is no great power himself, but his influence is, and his reputation is something that mad people crave. There's a bizarre appearance of Steve Coogan, it must be said, and the stuff with Brendan Gleeson was actually quite surprisingly dark. I didn't expect it, which made it even more impactful. So, all in all, it really isn't as bad as people are making out. In fact, it's nowhere near as bad as people are making out. I think there may be a case further down the line that this actually is better than the first. It's a courtroom drama at the end of the day, focusing in on the prisoner, but using his unfiltered psyche to show us all the elements of his head, real or fake, and his relationship with this lady. I don't think it's by any means perfect. I think that there are things about it that are really contrived. I think some of it is a little bit too dull for its own good. I think that some of the shots really aren't actually very creative, but much of Todd Phillips' work borrows from the same bleak view of human nature that this absolutely feeds into. Sometimes that really upsets me with stuff like The Hangover, but sometimes it actually feeds into the story, and this was an example of it doing better than that. It's not a 5-star film, it's probably not a 4-star film, but it's definitely not a 2-star or a 1-star film, and in all honesty, I really think this deserves some praise, which I don't think it's getting. So don't jump to conclusions on it and give it a chance yourself. Film number 6 that we will be reviewing here is Speak No Evil. This is essentially slashy for the Americans because Denmark is apparently the most depressing place for stories on planet Earth. The original Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales, by the way, are really quite sinister when it comes down to it, and the original version of this is even worse. It's written and directed by James Watkins, who did The Woman in Black and Part 2 of The Descent. It's a psychological horror film that is a remake of the 2022 Danish hit Gisteren. The story follows Louise and Ben and their young daughter Agnes, who are invited by a new acquaintance family that they meet, who is Patrick and Kira, to their secluded estate after a brief connection on holiday. While the visit begins warmly with unease somewhere sidling in the background, fear starts to creep in as the true dynamics of their host's family emerge, most notably Patrick's disturbing treatment of his son, who is unable to speak. As the tensions escalate, the Americans realise that they are trapped in an increasingly sinister situation, unable to leave without facing the horrifying reality of their host's secrets, serving as a brutal exploration of social discomfort and the terrifying cost of just being polite. It's a Blumhouse production, and it debuted earlier in the year in September, but it's already stirred lots of strong reactions, mainly for the performance of James McAvoy. We will touch on that in a second. But the original Danish, this is something I really want to get across here, the original Danish version is so unbelievably bleak, it makes this look like Wonka. This kind of feels, in a really weird way, like an episode of The Office turned into a horror film, because so much of it is unbearable unbearably cringeworthy. And, watching people try and be polite about inherently ridiculous and upsetting behaviour, some of which is done in jest and some of which very much isn't, it's a sort of frustrating scream at the telly film where you're just dying for people to get out and not be polite and try and escape the awkwardness of each situation. But it's also a story about how quite often men are so useless that women have to do bloody everything. The big plus point here is James McAvoy, who is clearly having the time of his life. He got absolutely shredded for this, like he's properly jacked, and he goes at a million miles an hour. He's a very convincing West Country figure, and he's delightfully crazy. He's funny and utterly sinister at the same time. It might put him in awards contention, this, but, we shall see. Judgment reserved on that. If you want a more conventional horror film, you choose this over Starvaker any day. It was far more coherent and less plodding, but you do have to question how necessary it was, particularly when it's so diluted down for the American audience. It is creepy and sinister, and it is definitely engaging and really funny and enjoyable at many occasions. But the standout bit of work is definitely Mr. Tumnus, who has gone absolutely berserk, so much so that it's a wonder of the start of the film they don't just take one look at the man and think, yeah, serial killer. You just want them to leave the rabbit behind. Bloody kids. It is definitely worth a watch if you're in the mood for a fun horror film, but if you really want the authenticity of what it's trying to go for, you're going to have to go and watch the Danish one, but just be prepared that it's a lot more bleak than this one. But yeah, don't go back for the rabbit. Okay, you will be pleased to hear that I have very much saved the best till last. This is going to be battling for my film of the year without question, and it is Conclave. It is directed by Edward Berger, because he's Austrian, I think. So that's the guy who did All Quiet on the Western Front and All My Loving. And it's written by Peter Strawn, who wrote Wolf Hall, which is a fantastic series. And it's based on the Robert Harris novel. It delves into the cloistered, high-stakes world of a papal election. Following the sudden death of the Pope, the College of Cardinals gather to elect a new leader for the Catholic Church. Cardinal Thomas Lawrence, played by Ralph Fiennes, is tasked with overseeing the process. He uncovers a web of secrets with political manoeuvring and moral dilemmas that threaten to upend the Church's very foundations. As the conclave progresses, tensions rise between candidates representing various ideological factions, from traditionalist to liberal, and amid this volatile atmosphere, revelations emerge that shake the institution to its very core, forcing Lawrence to confront his faith and the Church's future. The film boasts a properly stellar cast with Stanley Tucci, John Lithgow and Isabella Rossellini, and offers a gripping exploration of power, morality and human frailty within one of the world's oldest institutions. Featuring the most diabolical vape hit of all time, I want to gush endlessly about how this film might be perfect. It has endless riches, but let's begin with a titanic performance from Ralph Fiennes. It is about time this man got the Oscar he so very much deserves. He displays just about every emotion in this in such a delightfully controlled way, which is indicative of the entire thing. It's suspenseful, intriguing and fascinating without being sensationalized, and his character is immediately someone you can recognise from the second he turns up at the dead Pope's bedside as someone who is confronting the loss or losing of his faith, and his performance mirrors that so perfectly. The exploration of the politics of the church being just another breeding ground for actual politics is so brilliant an idea, and I don't care about similarities or differences with any other films or people who think it's silly and thin. It just isn't. The premise for the film is glorious. High-tension democracy, full of Chinese whispers, kept in a series of locked rooms where no one can have contact with the outside. And yet, the plot is constantly moved forward by murmurings and opinions of those people on the outside. Each figure is a glorious capsulation of a different perspective, idea, notion, or politics, and basically the film is Gossip Girl about the Pope. Who doesn't want to watch Gossip Girl about the Pope? It's actually stupid. I don't even like Gossip Girl, and I was watching this, sipping the tea, saying, please, your eminency, spill all the beans. I was loving life. It looks divine. Some of the metaphors set up in the visuals are downright outrageously good. I'm thinking particularly of a shot with lots of umbrellas, shots on the stairs and in the canteen. Stephanie Fontaine's work as DOP is sublime, and she really deserves a good look in for awards because it's brilliant. It's also got an absolutely delicious script with lines such as, "I thought we were here to serve God. Don't be so naive." And are we seriously considering the least worst option? You bloody bet we are, my son. Welcome to democracy. It contains some of the most nerve-shattering moments I've seen in a long time, one of which I genuinely don't know the last time that I felt something like that watching a film. It took me so by surprise. My body didn't move, and yet I felt my insides sort of start to convulse. I genuinely don't know that there's an element of this film I don't think is fabulous. Even by the end, where you could find the narrative a little over-egged and it's sort of one thing after the other, it could even be a little bit obvious in terms of where it ends up, but it feels so gratifying to watch. It is a cautionary tale against reactionary conservatism told through religious Chinese whispers, which turn something as mundane as choosing the Pope into something quite extraordinary to behold. I almost don't want to tell you any more than that because I want you to have the experience for yourself and know as little as you can. For me, at the minute, Ralph Fiennes for the Oscar. This has to be up for adapted screenplay as well. Sister Agnes is one boss woman. That's something else to note. The exploration of lots of women looking on at these ridiculous men and just being able to take a step back and realise quite how ridiculous they all are is another fabulous string to the film's bow. It's a fantastic experience, Your Eminence, and I don't know that there will be a film this year that actually manages to beat it. So there we go, 7 reviews of films that came out in the last few weeks and months that I thought I'd chuck on here. I do tend to put some more concise thoughts on Letterboxd if you do fancy following me on that over there. It's just my name. And as I said before, the next podcast will be the Christmas special where I'll be joined by many people to discuss our top 5 favourite movie characters. It's going to be a big one. I will see you for that one, and thank you very much for listening and for all your support and kind words across 2024. The figures for my Spotify Wrapped came out, which I had a look at, and you know, we're not rocking with big numbers here, but it's really, really touching to me to know that people are listening and people are engaging, and that means a lot. So I'm going to continue to bring you everything I can, and here's to another good year. Bye!